Two more quarterbacks visited the Steelers as NFL draft visits. Who were they, and who was recently mocked to the Steelers at the quarterback position going the first round by Mel Kiper? We'll talk about that and more about the quarterback position and whether the Steelers take one in the first round. I'm Chris Carter. To join me today will be Josh Taylor here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things in the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, hit the like button on this video. Hit the subscribe button to our YouTube channel to get all of our daily updates as well as our breaking news updates that come out from time to time. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day. Joining me today, as always, on Thursdays, our man from 93.7 The Fan, from KDKA TV, from everywhere. You can find him on Twitter at Josh Taylor HT. It's the man himself, Josh Taylor. What's up?
What's going on, man? We're still like in that, we're starting to get into that limbo where we're like 2 weeks out from the draft and there's not a lot going on like in that last bit before the draft. And you kind of want the draft to get here so you can stop talking so much about the draft.
Yeah, hey.
Hope something else happens. And we're like, all right, we're in that holding pattern. So you're getting a little bit eager, but you don't want to get too eager. I'm ready for it to be here.
No, I'm ready for it too, because we've talked a lot about this. I've watched so much tape of just random players that are supposed to be fourth and fifth round guys. It's getting old, but it's not getting old to talk about the possibilities of what could be the future of this franchise at the quarterback position. Now, of course, we all know the Steelers have placed interest in at least the top five quarterbacks, but two more quarterbacks were set to visit them this week. According to Ian Rappaport, Matt Corral, the Ole Miss quarterback who was injured in his bowl game, he visited with the Steelers Wednesday. And Carson Strong, the Nevada quarterback who played, in the Senior Bowl, he needs to visit with the Steelers on Thursday. And it kind of reignites the question, are the Steelers going to take a quarterback in the first round? Now, I did have a couple of fans, listeners, and audience members try to hit me up and ask me, do you think with the passing of Dwayne Haskins that the Steelers are going to get a quarterback at 20? I didn't feel like answering at the time. I brought this up yesterday. I feel like it's a little soon for that. His funeral date just got announced. Like, we're still dealing with that. His family's still dealing with that. The Steelers are still dealing with that. That's not something that, I pride myself on talking about. But I do think that all it does is say that they do need another camp arm, for sure. It doesn't, to me, make it a surefire thing to go at 20, to go for a quarterback at 20. And Josh, you and I have talked about this a lot over the past couple months, but I do think even if Dwayne Haskins was, we wish he was alive so that we could see him in this camp battle, so we could see him live out the rest of his life. I still feel like this is a year where, unless there's a magical drop off of quarterbacks that fall to you in the first round, the Steelers are probably not going to take one, because there's going to be a defensive star, some sort of superstar at another position that's like we don't get too many shots at these type of caliber players at this position because of normally where we pick.
Yeah, I'd make the case too that there may be an offensive player there.
Yeah, yep.
They don't have a shot at normally. That might fall there. It could be one of those receivers. It could be, one of those offensive linemen that's probably more highly regarded. This is the possibility that you live in when you're drafting at 20. I mean, we talk so much, and you've heard this so much throughout the years. The guys that are in the top 10 picks, what those guys are. What they're projected to be. At least have an understanding of what the teams that draft them, or how the teams that draft them feel about them, or what they expect out of them. Then you start to get to the teens, and there are a couple of guys that probably fit in that same group in the top 10 that just, maybe slip down based on need or whatever the other teams were thinking. Then you start to get to the late teens and early 20s, and you wonder, okay, just which guys are going to be left that fit in that top 10 group, which guys may not fit that top 10 group that are available, and which ones might not necessarily be reaches at that point. That's where it gets kind of sketchy. That's where it gets kind of shady. So this is where you wonder just how this is going to go, because there's a lot of different factors rolled up into this. There's a handful of teams that have more than one pick ahead of the Steelers. I want to say 5 have at least 2 picks. There's a handful of teams that have quarterbacks, and a couple of them are in the top 10. I'd make the argument Carolina at 6 probably helps start that domino effect, what happens with the Steelers at quarterback. I'd say Seattle at 9 probably has a lot to do with that. I'd say Atlanta now probably has a lot to do with that. I wouldn't rule out the Saints at this point, them having 2 picks in that top 18 or 19. So that's another thing you kind of roll into all of this. And we're totally ignoring the fact that the Giants might say, hey, if this kid's in our lap, maybe we're not sold on Daniel Jones. That's a possibility too. So there's so many different things that are just ahead of them as far as possibilities there, not counting what other teams that aren't looking for quarterbacks might or might not do. You might see one trade down. You might see one move their way up to get another player that they like. There's so many variables. So for me to sit here and think, just based on the fact that the Steelers are doing their due diligence with the quarterback position, for me to just assume that they're going to take their guy at 20, I think it's completely ignoring the fact that so many different things can happen ahead of them outside of the quarterback position before you even look at the teams that could influence what happens at the quarterback position. So yeah, I kind of feel the same way you do. If this team's in a position where there's a game-changing defensive player, whether it's one of those linebackers from Georgia, whether it's one of those defensive linemen from Georgia, whether it's a corner, whether it's Andrew Booth or maybe even a Derek Stingley at corner, you figure if one of those guys can be there to make this defense that they've done a lot of work retooling in the offseason that much better, and they may not have the quarterback prospect they want, maybe that's not the worst thing in the world, trying to make your defense better in the interim while you find that quarterback.
It might not be the worst thing in the world, but also taking a step at quarterback could also be a very good thing in the world. And again, I'm saying this just because I want to make sure that people that are thinking this way are at least represented a bit on the show, because
Yes.
anyone that listens to the show, watches the show, knows you and I are on the same page. It's like, Malik Willis, okay, if he falls to 20, great, but you're in a position where you need to rebuild a lot of different things. You could do that without trading up. You could do that by staying right at 20, addressing some of those, and then using next year's draft to be the year that you get aggressive at that quarterback class. But there are other aspects to apply to this, and questions about what if certain guys fall to them. I want to talk about that, about who might fall to them with a mock draft that was recently released by Mel Kiper, the possibilities of that quarterback being with the Steelers, and also what about later picks like Carson Strong. We'll do that in just a second here, but first we're going to talk to guys about BetOnline.net. Y'all know BetOnline.net, number one source for all your betting stats and sports information. When you're trying to put money down on games with the NBA playoffs here, NHL playoffs right around the corner, Major League Baseball is back in full swing. You got to get your action in. Go to BetOnline.net. They have all the latest sports developments, league reviews, news, including this year's basketball playoffs at the start of the Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs to esports and more. Head to their website today to use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in the action when you visit BetOnline, where the game starts. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Josh Taylor, talking about your Pittsburgh Steelers here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Also, we've got lots of NFL draft events coming up here on the Locked On Podcast Network. I myself participated in a full ultimate mock draft series. It'll be debuting here, so stay tuned. Check out the Locked On NFL YouTube page, our Locked On NFL channel, to get all of our updates from all the picks going around, not just to learn what we're doing here, but also to learn what other teams might be doing, what other teams and their hosts might be thinking that their teams are going to be up to. It's a fun show. Do check out what they're doing. But let's get back into the quarterback talk here. Now, Mel Kiper recently did his 2-round mock, Josh, and in this 2-round mock, had the Steelers going after Kenny Pickett at 20th overall. It's an interesting way to see how the things break out on his board. And his board, Malik Willis did go to the Panthers at 6. They passed on Kenny Pickett. They went Willis, and then everyone else were position players. You saw the receivers fly off the board. Actually, in this draft, Garrett Wilson was the first one off the board. They had Drake London, Chris Olave, and Jameson Williams all gone. At the cornerback position, you had Derek Stingley get off the board. Trent McDuffie get off the board. Ahmad Gardner was the second cornerback. It was the second player overall off the board. So you had those guys going, and it makes you sit and wonder, okay, would the Steelers take a shot on a guy like Pickett? Because Pickett's a guy, and I've covered him a lot, for my covering of Pitt football. I've covered him a lot. I've talked about him a lot on this show because of his leadership skills. Those are very real. He's a very accurate quarterback. He's the hard work. He's the teammate that you want in the locker room. But downsides. Forget his hand size. I don't talk about. I hate that. I think that's the part that's overblown. It's his arm strength. He can zip the ball up to about 20, 25, 30 yards. But when he starts getting to those deep balls that you need to fit deep down the sideline, and when you're attacking a defense further down the field, that's where his balls start to hang, and that's where his passes are not the NFL caliber that you hope for. And he's gotten better at that. But those are the things that NFL teams are like saying, yeah, that's why he's not first overall. Also, being 24 years old. That's something that shouldn't be overlooked. The Steelers typically like to get guys that are in the 20 to 21, at worst 22 range, because that means when you're coming up at the end of your rookie contract, you're looking at 25, 26 years old, and then you're saying, okay, now we're getting to your veteran time in the NFL. Your body's not as beat up, and we can sign you to a long-term deal that's actually going to help us out. But Josh, if the board fell this way, if say the best cornerback on the board was Andrew Booth, if say let's see, Jordan Davis went before, so he'd be off the board. 4 offensive tackles flew off the board, and Kenny Pickett was sitting there. By the way, the players picked after Kenny Pickett in Mel Kiper's mock draft here. Devin Lloyd went to the Patriots. Christian Watson went to the Packers. Treylon Burks to the Cardinals. We had Daxton Hill, Jahan Dotson, Devontae Wyatt, Zion Johnson, Andrew Booth, George Karlaftis, Tyler Linderbaum, and Lewis Seen all go in the first round. Is that a move that you would sign on for, taking Pickett there with all those names that I just mentioned still being on the board?
The fact that Karlaftis was still there, that is
that's
one
a
that
surprise, right?
catches my attention. Wow. There's a list of names there. I'm sitting there thinking, that the Steelers have these guys available, they're probably going with these guys instead of Kenny Pickett. And Andrew Booth is probably at the top of that list for me, just because he kind of covers a couple different categories that they like. We know they got to see him up close. We know he's significantly younger than Kenny Pickett. Plus, he fits a position that they're probably looking to fortify in the next couple of years. Because we can say what we want about the guys that they signed in free agency, but the truth of the matter is they only signed them to 2-year deals. So they're looking to still find some kind of long-term solution instead of just trying to tie themselves over at all these different positions. You can't keep tying yourself over every position and then try to reload all over again. That's not how it works. This is why you try to fortify that through the draft. Now, coming back around to Kenny Pickett, there was a time when I thought the Steelers drafted Kenny Pickett made perfect sense. But that was before they signed Mitchell Trubisky.
Yeah, that's a big part of this.
I feel like if you're going to draft a Kenny Pickett, you're not going to sign a Mitchell Trubisky, which now, in hindsight, since we've talked about this team losing Dwayne Haskins, rest in peace, this makes this even more of a man. It makes it even more sense that they did this, because just imagine if they hadn't signed Mitchell Trubisky in free agency. Now we're looking at this as, hey, or Mason Rudolph for that matter. Now we're looking at this as, hey, this team becomes a much more desperate team to find that quarterback, and maybe it changes their course for what they do in the draft. And maybe at that point, drafting a Kenny Pickett at 20 maybe makes sense. But since Mitchell Trubisky's under contract, I have a hard time believing that Kenny Pickett would be their guy. It would make more sense for me if I'm an NFL GM, if I'm a team that needs a quarterback that can start right now, if I have a plug-and-play guy I can put in immediately and have him get out there and go, that makes more sense for Kenny Pickett. Right now, with what the Steelers have just done in free agency, I don't know if Kenny Pickett fits anymore. But some of those other players that you mentioned were still on the board, they do fit, because they are guys that could be plug and play immediately. They don't have somebody that they just signed in free agency maybe sitting in front of them, or possibly stunting their development based on where their floor is. There's a much better, I think, long-term investment with some of those other guys on the board. It would just seem kind of backwards for the Steelers to put that kind of contract. Now, granted, once again, Mitch Trubisky's contract isn't that expensive. It's not a huge money contract.
Right.
So maybe that's the one thing you're looking at and saying, okay, maybe that's a saving grace. But at the same time, I have a hard time with them making that kind of free agency move, drafting a guy in Kenny Pickett that should probably be plugged in immediately, and then trying to ignore other places where they can build up, and safety still being one of those positions. So that's another thing that kind of sticks out to me. But I kind of have a hard time believing that Kenny Pickett could be the guy at 20 with so many other players on board that could help them right now.
And that's a big part of this, is the right now factor. Because also right now, if Kenny Pickett were to sit, like say he comes in and he's NFL ready, but he's not as NFL ready as Mitch Trubisky, because literally Trubisky has been in the NFL, then you're sitting him down and you're saying, okay, well, you're not playing until you're 25. or 26. And then you're saying, okay, what did we spend that first round pick last year for? And that's where I'm coming from on this, is that Malik Willis would be great. We have Tony Serino. He's Malik or nothing else. That's he's going for Malik or broke. But there's
Trubisky's traded to Malik or broke already, Tony. Jeez,
right? Because I thought Trubisky was his guy.
All right,
so that Tony Serino guy, he's a little bit fishy sometimes. But I really think that there's a chance that if the Steelers take a quarterback in this draft, it's going to be later than the first round. It might even be the second round. I don't think it's going to be Desmond Ridder, because I think Ridder's boosted his profile enough. If the Steelers don't take him at 20, he's probably going past. He's probably not making it out the first round. He might go early second round. But I've seen mock like this, like in our mock draft, the Seahawks took Desmond Ridder right after I took Jordan Davis. Right. Yeah. So, and also, by the way, in my mock draft, in our mock draft in Locked On, I took Jordan Davis, at 20th overall. So I was like, I'll take that all day. But the question then becomes, what do they do if they go get one of those quarterbacks? Because Kevin Colbert did say they wanted to go to camp with 4 arms, and unfortunately, the sad tragedy of Dwayne Haskins' death has put them in a position where that's going to be a lot harder to do. Unless you make some moves here. Now, you still could just get a later round quarterback, but I want to talk about who some of those guys are. And Carson Strong, the guy who's visiting with the Steelers this Thursday, who he is, what he factors in, and where they might be able to get him and other options. So we'll talk about that in just a sec. But first, we got to talk to you about one of our great sponsors, Shady Rays. Now, Josh, I'm doing this now because I got my pair of Shady Rays. Bam, we got the Shady Rays on, baby. They're the independent sunglasses company that gives you the features of $200 sunglasses for a fraction of the price. That means you get sunglasses like these with polarized lenses, well-constructed durable frames, and premium high-end finishes. Also, something that you won't find anywhere else is Shady Rays' Insane Protection Program. Shady Rays includes lost and broken protection on every pair. They will send you a brand new pair if you lose them, no matter what happened. Give them a try, and if you don't love them, you'll pay nothing. It's as simple as that. Plus, 10 meals are donated to fight hunger in America when you shop with Shady Rays. Exclusively for our listeners, head to shadyrays.com and use the promo code Locked On. That's LOCKEDON, Locked On, and you'll get 50% off of an order of 2 or more pairs of polarized sunglasses. Again, that's code Locked On for their best deal of the season. 50% off 2 or more pairs of Shady Rays sunglasses, backed by over 150,000 verified 5-star reviews when you visit shadyrays.com. We're also brought to you by rockauto.com. Save time and money when using Rock Auto. Why choose to spend 30%, 50%, or 100% more for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership? For example, if you go into a car dealership, a Honda Odyssey fuel pump could cost you $353. But if you go to rockauto.com, that price gets chopped down to $216. Rock Auto is a family-owned business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years. Rock Auto's prices are reliable for every customer. They have everything you can need, from brake parts to tail lamps to motor oil and even new carpet. Go to explore their easy-to-use website today to find the solution to your auto part needs by visiting rockauto.com right now, and you'll see all the parts available for your car or truck. Be sure to write Locked On in there. How did you hear about us box, so that they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliable low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. Visit rockauto.com today. And Josh, when we do back-to-back ad reads, we keep it rolling. No need for the interlude, because that's what we're doing here. Plus, I'm going to take these sunglasses off because I'm in my house, and it's ridiculous to wear sunglasses inside unless you look cool, like wearing some Shady Rays. Now,
I was impressed that you read all that with the sunglasses on. That's actually pretty good.
But that's how clear these are, though, for real. Like, I was reading text and stuff with these sunglasses on, looking at. You could probably see on my social security number off my computer screen right now. It's like, for all the web heads that trying to steal my stuff, no, it's not even close here. You ain't never going to get that, so don't even try it. But point being, these are pretty clean. They actually do help me see when I'm driving. So check out some Shady Rays. They're really great, and they look good. So anyways, let's get to talking about some of these later round quarterbacks. Now, we all know the top 5 quarterbacks that seem to be universal in this class. There's Malik Willis, there's Kenny Pickett, there's Desmond Ridder, there's Matt Corral, and then the guy that's kind of like hanging around at 5 is Sam Howell. Now, Sam Howell, North Carolina quarterback, going into this season, a lot of people projected him to be he was going to be the Trevor Lawrence. He was going to be the guy that everyone's going to be talking about, and then he didn't have that kind of a season at North Carolina. And in fact, Kenny Pickett kind of had a season he was supposed to have at North Carolina. But he's 6'1". He kind of has a Baker Mayfield build to him. Now, he doesn't have a Baker Mayfield vibe. I don't know if you saw the video of him talking about how he was disrespected. That's another story. We'll let the Browns handle that over there. But looking at Sam Howell, a lot of people are very cautious about what might happen or about the Steelers trying to select him at 20. I don't think that they would do that. 52 might be a different story, but I like the idea of waiting around to maybe get a Carson Strong. Carson Strong, 6'3", taller quarterback. You know, he had some knee problems, but he has an absolute cannon from while throwing with Nevada. That's a guy. If you can get him, say you could trade up at the back end of the second round, or he's there in the third round, that's a guy. I totally see the Steelers saying, okay, we can live with him.
I've had this discussion with a couple different people. I got into an argument about it recently. I think it was online. We were having this discussion. And my reasoning was, look, this is a team right now that's picking number 20 in the draft. For all the reasons I laid out before, that you might not get a top quarterback prospect falling to you at 20. As a matter of fact, it's super rare that happens.
Yeah.
On the other side of things, after this season's played out, I don't expect them to pick in a position to get a top quarterback next year. They're probably going to be in the same spot next year. I expect late teens to early 20s for them to draft in the same spot next year, because the way this team is being put together, they're probably going to win another 9 games, possibly even 10 if they can steal one, which probably puts them in a possible playoff spot and probably drafting in the late teens, early 20s in next year's draft. So we might be in the same boat next year, where we're looking at them possibly not in position to draft a top guy. If that's the case, and you're left with one of these later round guys, let's say second or third round guys, if you draft a quarterback day 2, it might make more sense. Draft a guy that you can develop over the next year or two while you're able to take that extra time and do it, as opposed to saying, oh, well, we'll just try again next year. We'll just try again the year after that. Well, based on what this team is built upon, they may not be in position to do it next year, because they may win more games that put them out of position to draft a high-profile guy next year. So why not draft a guy, if you can, on day 2, that you can spend that same amount of time when you're waiting for a guy that may never come, developing one you can get on day 2 or maybe even early day 3. Not that I expect early day 3 to happen. I think if it's going to happen, it's going to happen either day 1 or day 2. That's just my expectation. But my thought process was, if you're this team, and if we're thinking realistically, they're going to win somewhere between 8 and 10 games next season. So they'll probably be closer to the same closer to the same position. So why not try to take the guy that you can develop, so maybe he'll be ready in 2 to 3 years, instead of waiting for the guy that may not come, and also the guy that you're developing who also might fit into what you're trying to do as a team that, I'm still going to harp on this, that I think it's going to be very heavily built upon defense, ball control, and running the football and setting up opportunities and play action. So if you can draft a guy to develop to fit that scheme, why not do that instead of trying to bank on something or betting big chips on something that may not come the way you want it to?
It's a good question. It's a good question. But here's my other thing to counter what you were saying about next year. They probably won't be. I agree. I anticipate this team to still be competitive this season, even with Mitch Trubisky at quarterback. I think that they're on the fringe of the playoffs, if not in the playoffs. And doing so, they'll probably end up with a lower 20s, higher teens pick, like you said. But here's the difference: is that if you do it right this year, if you go and get your cornerback or your safety in the first round, or your defensive tackle that makes your defense that much better. If you go and get maybe another offensive lineman, a playmaker, a wide receiver, or someone else, if you fill the necessary holes on your roster around Mitch Trubisky, Mason Rudolph, and whoever else you drafted quarterback this year, you put yourself in a position where next year you don't feel as desperate to make a lot of to draft a lot of these guys. And then when you're sitting there at 20, you know what? The Chiefs had a further back drafting spot when they traded up to go get Patrick Mahomes. I would not put it past the Steelers to be amping up to get that. Another part about what could happen here is trading picks this year and saying, hey, you know what? The guy that we were looking for at this spot wasn't here. What if we trade to get some draft capital, either back in, or early in the draft, or even next year? Because that's the other part of this. Look at what the Saints are at. Look at where the Eagles are at. If there was a Trevor Lawrence this year, if there was, a guy, well, Patrick Mahomes didn't go first overall, but if there was a guy of his caliber that everyone knew was like, oh, that's the guy, we're going to go get the guy. If there was a clear number 1 quarterback, it would be tough to compete with those teams that have multiple picks in the same draft, because they'd have all that ammunition. And maybe the Steelers could use some of that ammunition next year. I agree that there's a chance that if at the back end of day 2, you see the Steelers go in, get their quarterback, and say, all right, we're adding him to the mix. We want another young guy to be throwing the ball around in Latrobe when we get training camp going. But I also would not be surprised if they're still going best player available, if they're saying we find these guys who can add to us right now and help us across the board. We're not going to just sell out for the quarterback position. Maybe we'll sign some free agent arms that haven't been signed to teams and just bring them into camp. And the plan will just be those guys and Mason and Mitch will just have it out in the practices.
Yeah, and I think the thought process that you laid out of possibly, collecting some of that draft capital for next year, whether it's trading down a few spots in the first round or trading out of the first round to early second round and maybe get the guys that you want. I don't mind the thought of that. And this is really one of those things where, I think this is where we come back to the approach during the offseason and what they did in free agency and really trying to fortify a lot of the depth that they needed across the board, because now they are in a position where they can do all of the things we just laid out. They can go best player available at 20 if they want to and keep things moving. They can do that and then maybe trade late into the late first round or early second round to go get a quarterback if there is one still there. They can maybe trade out or trade down and collect capital for last year like you're talking about. Kevin Colbert did a good enough job this offseason where they have that kind of flexibility. They are really more prepared than I think people think they are to be that flexible where they can say, you know what, we don't know how the cards are going to fall, but if they fall this way, we can do this. If they do this thing, we can do that. They put together a really nice flow chart where they don't have to be married to one concept. They don't have to be married to best player available at 20. They don't have to be married to, draft a quarterback here. They don't have to be married to trading down. They can wait and they can sit back and wait and say, okay, let's see what everybody else is going to do, because there's so many different possibilities. And a lot of that is directly tied to the fact that Kevin Colbert took the approach that he did in this offseason to build a lot of depth to where this team doesn't really need a lot of starters except at the safety position where they have to try to fill a spot right away. And even if they don't fill that spot right away in the draft, I know a lot of people probably aren't necessarily thrilled about it, but at least the Carl Joseph signing ties you over because he is a former first-round pick. I know people probably aren't comfortable with that thought. And trust me, I get it.
Dude.
But it feels like one of those things like, okay, at the very least, it at least keeps a that nameplate in that slot for the time being. They have a lot more flexibility, and that's my point, than people are giving them credit for. So they don't have to do the one thing that we're saying or the other thing that they're saying. They can sit back and say, okay, let's see what the board tells us to do. And then they can move accordingly. And a lot of that's due to the fact that they spent a lot of time during free agency fortifying this roster, bringing back guys that they needed, bringing in new guys that they needed, and filling spots now that they don't have to do in a couple weeks when on the weekend when the draft comes.
And I think the final point with that is that this is why you do that, is you're protecting your pick. Back in 2016, when they selected Artie Burns, everyone knew they needed a cornerback. And what did the Bengals do? They made sure they went and got a quarterback right before the Steelers did. And it was like it's because they knew. And now you're in a situation where if you at least paint the illusion like, hey, all the while, Kevin Colbert and Mike Tomlin, they're probably saying, hey, we're going to getting, Malik Willis or Kenny Pickett or Jordan Davis or whoever is their top pick. But their job now is to do their due diligence, see about other guys, see what information comes about but wall off everything that people might be thinking about what the Steelers' plan is. Because if a team knows what the Steelers are going to try to do, they're going to trade up. And that's going to put them in a position where then the Steelers, their whole pick is compromised. And if you're compromised, that means you're going to be giving up a chance to get the guy you actually want. You want it to be somewhat of a mystery until you're ready to make the move, like you did with Devin Bush.
Right.
Because when Devin Bush was traded up for it, as soon as that trade was made, everyone knew what the deal was. But up until that moment, people were talking about, are they getting a cornerback? Are they getting this guy? Are they getting that guy? And as soon as the trade happened, then the Steelers were in control of their own destiny. That's where Kevin Colbert's put them in, and that's what it takes to protect your draft position, because that's something that I think is underrated or underappreciated by people when they start talking about what moves are made.
I'll throw the converse in that, because there's the other possibility on the other side of things, or maybe the guy that you didn't think might be there falls to you. Because I'll go back about 18 years ago when there was a possibility they could have a quarterback, and there were a handful of guys that were available in that first round. And the one that they didn't think would be there ended up being there because San Diego decided to draft a guy who didn't want to go there And the Giants were like, hey, well, if that guy doesn't want to be there, we'll take him. Tell us who you want. And San Diego wanted Phillip Rivers instead of Ben Roethlisberger. Think about this. So San Diego says, we want Ben Roethlisberger to earn a Corsi in the Giants. Maybe Ben Roethlisberger's a Charger and Phillip Rivers is probably a Steeler, or maybe they go in an entirely different direction. But the truth of the matter is, and we heard Doug Whaley say this in an interview, where when Phillip Rivers became the guy, the Steelers are going, wait a minute, we're going to get Ben Roethlisberger? Like, there's still that possibility. And this is the thing where, like I said before, you really don't know what's going to happen. So now you can sit back and say, hey, could the guy we want be there, or will we have to make another move to do so? But they can keep every card close to the vest now, because there's no real indication of what they might do. And the one starting position that is available is not one that they need to address in the first round. You don't need to draft a strong safety right away. You can still get one in the second or third round and be perfectly fine if you wanted to. Or there's still that, sign Tyrann Mathieu thing that's hanging over our heads as we go along into the month of April. So there's that thing too. But all of that comes back to the fact that, the flexibility that they have right now and the position that they're in, where they don't have to be pushed into one position. They did a really good job of arranging their pieces on the board and moving themselves into a position where they're not completely backed into making one particular move or another. They have a lot of flexibility where I don't think people expected it coming into this point.
I agree. That flexibility is very important. And like you said, you never know who comes up. You don't have to even go back to Ben Roethlisberger. They never thought Cam Hayward would fall down to the back part of his first round.
Or David DeCastro, for that matter.
Or David DeCastro. That was one that because they were dead set on Dante Hightower until David DeCastro fell, and they were like, well, we got to take that guy because he's going to solidify our offensive line. You never know who falls to you. We will see who falls to the Pittsburgh Steelers in a couple weeks. Actually, literally in 2 weeks, I believe is the start of the draft. So
and it still feels like 2 years.
And it still feels like it's 2 years away. My goodness, we got a lot to talk about. But thanks, Josh, so much for joining the Locked On Steelers podcast. We always appreciate having you here. Let me know they can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Josh Taylor HD is the best place to look. Of course, there's CBSN Pittsburgh. There's 93.7 The Fan. Also, the Odyssey app. You can catch me there, too. Or you can also catch the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'll throw that plug in there. So any of those places you look, you will find me.
I appreciate you throwing the plug in on my show. But no, serious. We're always happy to have you here, man. And it's always great to have you here and see you out doing all the things you do, because you bring great insight to the football world and to the sports world as well. Do check out Josh Taylor. He does a lot of great work. Check out this show on the Locked On Steelers podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you watch this on YouTube and you're still here, hit the like button. You probably enjoyed it if you're still here. If you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our breaking news updates whenever breaking news happens on your Pittsburgh Steelers. We're wrapping up the week with Jenna Harner. She'll be back here with the Friday episode, wrapping up the week, getting ready for the weekend right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.